Shadow of the Colossus is a legendary video game which I feel nobody would ever argue against. It's a unanimous claim that seldom anyone has ever argued against. Even with the criticism it has, no one can actually find true fault in the game's design and philosophy. I even remember back when it was first released, there was a lot of criticism over the game's lack of anything to do other than to just slay giant monsters, but as time went on, people embraced the quirk of a seemingly endless open world that made you feel isolated, lonely, and small. So very, very small. The game is loved by pretty much everyone that's ever played it, and even to this day, conversation for the game continues, with new pieces of lore being found by the community, new places to go through, new theorycraft videos, and content made on the game almost weekly. It's a game that's lived rent-free on everyone's mind since the very beginning, but with mysteries still popping up even today, there's one particular mystery that has remained prevalent within the Shadow of the Colossus community, and that of course being the 48 original Colossi. You heard that right, 48 Colossi, as in 48 bosses, as opposed to the 16 bosses you fight in the original game. Holy shit. Now keep in mind, when it comes to game development, oftentimes the loftier ideas are abandoned almost immediately before the actual development of the game. In the pre-planning stages, people come up with the story, art direction, concept art, and of course gameplay ideas. So while it is true at some point in development there were considered to be 48 bosses, this doesn't necessarily mean there ever was plans for them to ever exist, so gradually the number went down from 48 to just 26. Still a lot, but a significant reduction. I mean, keep in mind, 48 would have been a lofty goal even by today's standards, but the game was already pushing the limits of the PS2 as it was, so sizing back the map and the bosses was a smart decision, but the idea of having around 24 bosses, I mean, that's still crazy, but it makes sense when you look at the map. Upon closer inspection, the map definitely has a lot of room for at least 8 to 12 more bosses, and thanks to the uncovered data as well as concept art and old interviews, the fans have been able to uncover and unravel the mystery behind many of these missing bosses. Now, please keep in mind, some of these bosses exist in name alone. We just can't find anything more about them other than a few data files and scripts. So, for example, there's a Colossus named Yeti, but there's pretty much nothing on him other than just a few scraps of data found through data mining. Now, this is the same for 5 other Colossi that exist, seemingly in name only. But if we ignore those 5, we are left with 9 Colossi, and today we'll be taking a look at each and every one. Before we do that, however, it's important to note the map size. If there were supposed to be 9 other Colossi, was the size of the map ever affected? Well, speculatively speaking, no, it wasn't. The same exact size of the map used in the final game is the same exact map that was supposed to house all of the missing Colossi, and this is due in part that much of the map we can't explore is actually unfinished. This is the true size of the map right here, provided by Nomad Colossus, a wonderful Shadow of the Colossus fan and legend amongst the community, even to some of the developers. Seriously, I cannot do his video justice. He goes into great detail about each and every one of these Colossi because he has a true passion and love for the game, so please check out all of his videos if you're even slightly interested in game development or Shadow of the Colossus itself. Anyways, judging by this map and the textures overlay the game's actual landscape, it's pretty obvious there's some unfinished parts of the map. A good chunk of it is actually unfinished, so it can be speculated that a lot of this was either used for testing or potential battlegrounds for unused bosses. For some of these bosses, it is worth pointing out where in fact they could be, but for the others, it's nothing more than superfluous, but it is still interesting to talk about. That being said, not all bosses had a location or stage planned for them. For example, Monkey or Saru, it's one of the more unique Colossi that has little to no reason to be cut, probably due to the area itself being too complex, as he was supposed to hang from stalactites inside a giant cave. The cave in question, by the way, seemingly doesn't exist, or perhaps it was repurposed into Dirge's cave. Then there's Devil, described as a unique Colossus that was extremely small and needed to be dealt with through, interestingly enough, stealth. In some ways, there's quite a few Colossi that need some element of stealth in order to be dealt with, but actually hiding in tall grass and making this boss seem more like an MGS fight than anything else brings it up to a whole nother level. According to some sources, it would have been a boss that would have taken place in some ruined castle or temple that resided next to the dam. Griffin was a Colossus that was weak to fire, and it was meant to be dealt with atop of your horse aggro. Unfortunately, this boss was just too tedious if ever needed to be restarted, so the idea was eventually scrapped. Some elements of this boss can be seen in Colossus's boss fight and in some ways Dirge, as his battle puts heavy emphasis on riding aggro. This is only heavily emphasized by the placement of the Colossus, as it would have been right next to Dirge or atop some Finnish mountains. Phoenix was a flying Colossus that was completely engulfed in flames, making him impossible to grapple. The solution was to plunge him into a nearby lake. Many people believe that he would have needed to be fought near or at Bassaran's arena, seeing as how the exact same trees were used in the arena and in Phoenix's screenshots, but upon further digging into the game files, it was revealed the trees are actually labeled I-4 trees, meaning the quadrant at I-4, and Crater Branch. Rock is one of the few Colossi that actually has quite a lot of clear pictures on it, even gameplay footage of it in action, but this was obviously done before he was completely scrapped from the game. Through this, we can at least tell that he was much further in development than most of the other cut Colossi, but still cut nonetheless. I actually recommend watching this old and rare promo trailer for Shadow of the Colossus, as it has quite a few strange elements never added to the game, like this weird maybe map or esoteric health bar for the Colossus. Like, I don't know. I'm sure if anybody can get their hands on this build of the game, boy, Nomad Colossus would have years worth of content. Anyway, Rock was pretty typical in strategy when it came to him. Just shoot him down with a bow, that's it. Honestly, it would seem like the only reason this Colossus exists was because the team just really wanted a really long neck flyer, like, you know, the Giant Claw or something like that. He would have been located next to the wasteland with the other towers and structures, which makes sense. Sirius is an interesting boss, as some of the elements of its existence still remains in the game. Ever notice those weird Stonehenge-like structures just outside the temple? Well, that's how you would have fought Sirius. Attract them through these little gaps and he would have gotten stuck in between the rocks, allowing you to wail on the poor thing. Though, that was easier said than done. The main reason he was cut was simply because the mechanic just wasn't working out as intended. This has us assume that maybe he was cut late in development if the devs couldn't be bothered to remove the arena itself, or maybe they just liked it there. They do that a couple of times. I mean, seriously, what are these rings in the desert? Serious. Spider was a boss that just needed its legs chopped off with the sword, but it's not as simple as that. You'd actually need to be on Aggro's back and swing the sword, which would have been the one and only time that it was okay or useful to actually swing your sword on top of Aggro. The dev team thought it'd be too much work just to get a good functioning swing animation for Wander while on horseback, and seeing as how he would have only used this for one fight, the team just dropped it. Hey, animating video game characters is super hard, okay? I think it would have been a pretty cool boss fight, if not a little awkward. I just personally like the design of the thing. It's just so creepy. I hate it. I love it though at the same time. Possibly the most mysterious Colossi out of all the missing ones is of course Worm. The only thing we know other than how it looks is the fact that it had a weak point located on the flower bulb-like section of its body. Aside from that, it is interesting to note that in the preview version of the game, Dirge was mentioned to have a friend that shakes the earth with him. This could possibly be referring to Worm, and that does seem likely, as it's speculated the location of this boss was in B2, which is real close to where Dirge was. Not much is known as to why it was scrapped, but some argue that it was because of the sheer size of it, and it just clashed with the size of the arena, or it was just too similar to Dirge. Finally, The last Colossi I will mention is Yamori A, commonly known as the Gecko. It didn't really get far in past stages of development, so very few people have ever heard or even mentioned it. The reason why it's never got past testing was because it was too similar to another Colossus, which many have pointed out to be Kuromari. He's also this gecko-like weirdo Colossus, and it's also a boss that climbs up the walls, much like Yamori's original design plans. The only thing that exists of the character was a piece of artwork shown in the art book. It was also very likely this iteration was more or less just a beta design of Kuromari, so it's not like we had much to lose. If anything, he was just revived into a much cooler and simpler boss fight. Well, that was longer than expected. Still, it's fascinating to go through this game and its early builds, a hobby in which many in the community have partaken in. Seriously, this game has a lot of fascinating little details, and multiple hidden files within the game's data pretty much unravels a ton of lore, as well as mysteries and a glimpse into the rigid and weird world of game design. It also gives you some insight in the most dedicated fan base out there. Some people have even made mock-up screenshots illustrating just how these bosses would have looked like had they have been in the game. Hell, one person was even able to restore some of the bosses in this pretty ambitious fan remake called Beyond the Forbidden Lands, which seeks to restore the cut Colossi and makes it possible to fight all missing content. Shadow of the Colossus isn't unique in being a fascinating game or data mine or whatever, but there's so much of seemingly nothing in the game that it almost begs the question and is constantly explored, constantly theorized, and scrutinized to the finest details. Now, to an outsider, this might seem like scraping at the bottom of the barrel for content that simply isn't there, but for enthusiasts like the Shadow of the Colossus community and myself, it's just a mystery ready to be unraveled. And you can't lie, this shit is fascinating. I love it. And by the way, seriously, consider subscribing and checking out Nomad Colossus. He has mined the fuck out of the game for the past 10 years. Yes, 10 friggin' years. The things he's uncovered alone is what kept the community alive, and he is continuing his research deeper and deeper into the game's files and assets. And while you're at it, check out Max Dara as well. The dude's a massive fan of the game and has some fascinating lore videos on not just the game itself, but other video games, as well as other theory crafting videos. He's incredibly underrated, and I highly recommend you check out some of his stuff. Love you guys a ton. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.